Dr. George, thank you very much for coming on the podcast. How are you today?
I'm awesome, and it's very nice to be talking with you today, Patty. How are you?
Not too bad. As we mentioned before we started recording, I'm in that parent mode, so a tired, stressed parent mode. And who better to speak to you about that but you?
Well, I'm glad we can talk about that because that's a very popular topic.
It is, isn't it? It seems to be quite a thing with parenting. And we're here to talk about your book, Polyvagal Theory and the Developing Child, which you co-wrote with Dr. Marilyn Sanders, and it's subtitled Systems of Care for Strengthening Kids, Families, and Communities. I came across you and the book almost simultaneously when we were at a polyvagal conference in Berlin last year and read it with great interest. So it's a pleasure to be talking about it today. I'd like to start by asking what kind of caused you and your co-author to want to write this book and to write it?
Well, both of us had written chapters in an early polyvagal book. And polyvagal theory is about the nervous system and how we're detecting threat and safety and what what our nervous system does with that detection. And I had written a chapter in this book called Clinical Applications of the Polyvagal Theory that was edited by Stephen Porges, who created the theory, and Deb Dana, one of the leading speakers and writers on polyvagal theory. And I'd written a chapter on the doctor-patient relationship. And Marilyn, who's a neonatologist, had written a chapter on the neonatal intensive care unit where premature babies go or babies that are sick when they're born, because that's her area of expertise. And actually, Marilyn had the idea of writing a book for parents, and she wanted to write about younger children because she works with kids usually from birth to age 3, maybe 4 or 5. And our editor said, I love this idea of this book. And but we need to have it be for a wider range of kids, all the way up to 18. So we need to find another person that has expertise in that. And since Marilyn and I had gotten to know each other, and the editor, Deborah Malmood, and I had gotten to know each other, um, then it came together that way. And we really wanted people to have information about the nervous system because it really underlies all of what we're doing in our life, and whether we feel safe or not really has a huge impact on how we think, how we feel, the kinds of stories that we tell. And so it has a really big impact on kids too. And this first book was written for people in healthcare, therapists, people in education. Although a number of people have read it that are my friends or other people that I've known that don't have any particular kind of professional training or expertise, and they've really enjoyed it as well.
Yeah, I think reflection, both as someone who works in the parenting industry, but also as a parent myself, I don't think I've read a book which, and I really have read a lot of them, which so well puts out the journey from pre-birth, birth, those first early years through to the maturation of a child and the importance of attachment and physical contact and safety and security in such a comprehensive way. So for anyone listening to this thinking, oh, I really like to get deep in this, it is a book well worth getting. Let's let's maybe start with polyvagal theory, which, as you say, is very, very applicable, and I think for clinicians and for parents, it's really, really helpful. Can we go a bit deeper now into what polyvagal theory is and what it means for parents and how you use it in the book?
Absolutely. So it turns out one of the parts of our nervous system is the autonomic nervous system. That's the automatic nervous system that monitors how our heart is doing, our lungs, our kidneys, all of our organs. And it makes adjustments on a heartbeat to heartbeat basis in how my heart is beating, how my liver is releasing glucose, blood sugar into the bloodstream. And it does that without me having to think about it, without me even really knowing what's going on. But there's changes in my blood pressure, changes in how my kidneys are functioning. And it turns out that that same system is monitoring how safe we feel with each other in our environment, in our body, and it makes adjustments in how our organs are functioning based on those determinations as well. And So polyvagal theory is really about the nervous system and these kinds of monitorings and adjustments. Three different parts of the polyvagal theory. The first one is this monitoring part, which in the theory is called neuroception. And Stephen Porges, who created the theory, wanted to have a new word that was different than perception because it's outside of awareness. And so he coined this word neuroception. And this is occurring within milliseconds of things coming into our sensory awareness and determining this thing could hurt me, this thing is safe, I can relax, I need to be a little bit on guard. Neuroception is that monitoring. And then from neuroception, our nervous system can go into one of three different states. Um, there's a calm, relaxed, engaged, connected state like we're in right now. That's when we feel safe, that's the state that we go into. Most everybody's heard about fight or flight, which is a state of mobilization. Fight or flight, when I think about it, means, I'm going to be in a car wreck or there's a siren behind me or somebody pulls a gun. But if we think about it as mobilization, it doesn't have to be so dramatic as that. So something that's a little bit worrisome can also get a little bit of our adrenaline going. And then a third state is really a state of shutdown. That's immobilization. It's related to the freeze state. It's also related to a possum playing dead. And it also has an opposite kind of response to the fight or flight response, where our heart rate and blood pressure go up. In this immobilization response, our heart rate and blood pressure go down, can make us dizzy or even faint. So we've got neuroception, which is the monitoring. We have these three states, which are organized in a hierarchy. And then co-regulation is a third aspect of polyvagal theory. And that says our nervous systems are not only tuned into what's going around us in the physical environment, but tuned into each other as well. So our nervous systems, yours and mine, are tuned into each other right now, tuned into our facial expressions, our tones of voice, our gestures, all of those kinds of things. And if my nervous system is in a regulated state, one that's not getting too high, too low, it's staying calmer or at least more able to be in control, a regulated state, then my facial expression, my tone of voice will send signals to your nervous system that say, things are okay here. We're on the same team, we're on the same side, and everything in our environment looks fine to me too. And that'll have an impact on your nervous system that coaxes it to also relax, let down its guard, and to be more connected as well. So we've got that monitoring neuroception, we've got these three states, and then we have the way that nervous systems are connected with each other, again, on a very finely tuned basis. And so that's the basis of the polyvagal theory. This is happening all of the time. And depending on what we're detecting from within us or around us, our nervous system changes our physiology. And our physiology then makes us more revved up, makes us more calm and able to connect and be curious and to think and use our innovation and creativity, or to put us into a disconnected state because it says things are so upsetting or so worrisome that we better get out of here. If we can't get out of here physically, at least we can get out of here in consciousness or emotionally.
We're both smiling because George just did a thumbs up, and the camera, for those of you who are listening, the camera just did the same. So we're in a world of AI animation already. Nice moment of levity. So, if I understand correctly, George, these are systems which are taking place without our conscious thought, although we can become consciously aware of them if we're dialed into the experience.
That's correct. So we can become aware of what our nervous system is doing after the fact, after it does it. Here's an example from when I was 12. I was running around the corner of my house. I grew up in Houston, Texas, and suddenly I found myself in the air. And I say it that way because that was my experience. I had no like conscious memory or conscious awareness of myself leaping into the air. My body leapt into the air. And it was only when I was coming back down that I saw a garden hose that was coiled up. And it was a part of my house that I never went around. And I had run around chasing being chased by somebody trying to get away from them. And I had never seen the garden hose there before. And I go, oh, my my mind thought of it as a snake. My brain thought of it as a snake, made my body leap. But I didn't do that myself. And it took action on my behalf to keep me safe, but I didn't think of it. And so I became aware of what was going on after it happened, but I didn't become aware of it till I was on my way back down to earth.
I have to break in with my own anecdotes as well. I had this recently. I've been running in the forest in the dark, and I'm really scared of the dark for childhood reasons. And I heard a bird cry, which sounded a bit like a child screaming, which
Ah,
is quite a scary piece of sensory information to have at 3 o'clock at night in the middle of a dark forest. And then I saw a tree stump to my right, and my it looked very briefly like a tiger sitting in the forest. And I believe it was the same thing. My brain or mind, depending on how you want to start going into which bit does what first, created a tiger to make sense of the danger signals that I was misperceiving, or the signals I was misperceiving as danger. So this is happening. Yeah, of course, I blinked, and it does look still like I saw it the next day. It still looks a bit like a tiger, in my opinion.
yeah,
So
yeah.
this is happening inside us without us understanding it, and it's it's as you've mentioned already, the basis of the parent child and human interaction at every stage of the life cycle.
It is. If a child feels worried about something, their natural response is to look at the parent's face, to look at, if it's my child, to look at my face. That's called social referencing. And depending on the look on my face, um, then if I have a calm look, the child will take that as, okay, things are okay. Like if they were seeing a stump that they thought was a tiger, they look at dad, they look at mom, everything is calm here, they can relax. Um, we had a babysitter for our son named Frank, and he would do this. Um, he would, if our son Seth would fall down, he would say, safe at second base. And he would give him the signal that, you know, falling is a part of life. It's a part of this game called baseball. And, nothing to be worried about here. And as a matter of fact, he was a very remarkable person. He climbed this tree one time and he fell out. The limb that he was holding onto broke. I think he was
Oh.
about 10 feet up, not too high. But he, in his mind, was telling himself, I have to keep smiling on the way down because our son was looking at him. Now, that's a very high standard. I don't hold myself to that standard. I don't hold any parents to that standard, but I just put it there to because he knew that the look on his face was going to make an important difference to our son. That our son wouldn't be so worried if he saw Frank coming out of the tree looking like he was enjoying himself. And he landed and he wasn't hurt and everything was fine. But it communicated to our son, things are okay here.
So I'd like to go into more detail about how in the book you lay this out. So you do take it from pregnancy and birth onwards through the child's life cycle. But I've always been so curious because when I discuss this concept with parents, they seem to get it quite quickly. I think it's tremendously applicable. But from time to time, I'll hear from someone who goes, Polyvagal theory, oh, that's not scientifically proven. That's not credible. And it seems to be a thing. Now, I know if you get two scientists in a room, or two academics in a room, the violence score goes up pretty quickly. Um, Now, I just wonder if you've come across that and if you have an answer. I mean, you as a child psychiatrist, of course, I think probably know better than anyone how applicable this can be. What would be your answer to those people who say there's no scientific research behind this, or the autonomic nervous system is far more complex than polyvagal theory would account for?
So I tell people a few things. One is Stephen Porges just turned 80 a few months ago, and he has been doing research in this area since he was 21. So in 1966, he was a graduate student in the PhD program at Michigan State University. And in his first studies, he was studying, his program was called psychophysiology. And the physiology is how our organs are regulated, right? And psycho doesn't mean a crazy physiologist, it means that he's looking at the psychological impact on physiology and vice versa. And so he was looking at how does heart rate change, blood pressure change, and breathing rate change as a result of some cognitive exercises. And so he's been doing this research for what's that, 59 years. And so some of the parts of this research have been, very well studied, very well um, demonstrated. And Dr. Porges was the president of the American Society of Psychophysiology. And in fact, when he gave his presidential address in 1994, that's when he introduced the polyvagal theory. I'm just going to back up a step and I'll get back to the research part in a second. But the reason that he even started thinking about polyvagal theory was he had gotten a letter from a neonatologist, like my co-author. And the neonatologist said, I've noticed two things, Dr. Porges, and I wonder how you make sense of them. So one of the things that he said was the vagus nerve, which is part of this polyvagal theory and is related to both that safe state that we can get into as well as the shutdown state, that the vagus nerve can, when we measure its activity, can be a sign of resilience in a newborn baby. So we're getting into a little bit about what happens in babies. But also, babies in the neonatal intensive care unit sometimes have very scary um, situations where their heart rate and blood pressure crash, and the whole team has to help revive the baby, get their heart going again, their blood pressure back up, that kind of thing. And the neonatologist said, we also think that it's the vagus nerve that's doing that as well, that's causing the baby to crash. And so his question to Dr. Porges was, how can one nerve cause both a baby to crash and die, unless they're revived, and be a sign of resilience and health? And Dr. Porges said, that's an excellent question. And I have not even ever thought of that question before, which tells me that people can have questions that are very important to science, and we shouldn't hold back on asking our questions, you know. So Dr. Porges carried that letter around for several months with him in his briefcase. He would pull it out, he would think about it. And what he realized is that there are two different branches of the vagus nerve. And one of the branches of the vagus nerve seems to be older in evolution. One of the pieces of evidence that it's older is that it's unmyelinated, meaning it doesn't have that coating around it that's like insulation around a wire. And another part originates from a different part of the brainstem, and it does have that coating around it, that myelin sheath. And so what Dr. Porges then ended up saying is, oh, it's not that there's one nerve doing two different things. It's actually two branches of the vagus, and they do two different things. And so there are some things within the polyvagal theory that are very well demonstrated. So if I stand up, there's a branch of the vagus that goes to my aorta, that big vessel that comes off the heart, and measures the stretch of the aorta. So it's actually measuring kind of how much blood pressure there is. And if I stand up, there's a little less blood pressure because now the blood is going down to my feet more and there's more gravity for the heart to work against. So that end of the vagus sends a message up to the brainstem. And then from the brainstem, it sends another branch of the vagus sends a message down to the heart and says, beat faster if my blood pressure is dropped a little bit. This is very well demonstrated. And this is happening on a heartbeat to heartbeat basis. There are some parts of the polyvagal theory like this part that says there's an older branch and a newer branch, and some animals have it and some don't, and maybe bony fish and reptiles 500 million years ago developed this playing possum reflex. And so It's called the polyvagal theory because it's a theory that means we're testing it out to see. So there's some things that are more well tested, some things that are less well tested. But what I know as a child psychiatrist is that the theory has a great deal of utility, meaning that when I'm thinking in this way with parents, with kids, with the staff at the residential facilities that I work with, then it allows me to predict things like this kid should be feeling calmer now and they're not. And it gives me things to think about. So, what can I think about? Maybe there's something that's still threatening their nervous system. And if there's something that's still threatening their nervous system, then that's going to be why they haven't calmed down in a situation where I expect them to. And I'll give you an example of that. Um, in the with the kids that I work with that have been traumatized, um, a lot of times when they feel closer to somebody, which is actually when a lot of us relax, feel calmer, feel more secure, but for those kids, they feel less secure. But as I started to think about it and read about it and study with other people like Dan Hughes, who created dyadic developmental psychotherapy, what I learned and realized is for a kid who's been traumatized, especially one that's been traumatized by a caregiver early on, relationships are dangerous. And so for them, in order to stay safe, they have to stay disconnected from people. But if they start to feel close to me or one of the staff at the residential facility, then their nervous system says, danger, danger. We shouldn't get close to people because people are dangerous. And so now I can make sense. Oh, that's why this kid is reacting this way. And then when I teach people like teachers, that makes sense to them too, because they've seen that in their classroom, or therapists or the doctor in the emergency room. Why is this kid having a different reaction than 90% of kids that I see? And so the theory has a great deal of utility, meaning it can allow me to predict, adjust, know what's going on in working with kids, in working in the doctor-patient relationship. I taught medical students how to talk with their patients for 12 years, and I would teach them the same thing. And I would teach them, watch your patient's facial expressions, and if they look like that they're getting more nervous, find out what's going on that their nervous system has had this reaction. And so that's the way I think about it. Now, some things I'm not a neuroscientist by training. I love neuroscience. I love reading about it, studying about it, and applying it. So that's the way I think about it. So a long answer, but it also takes us into a little bit of the other things that we could talk about with the book.
Yeah, I'm already just regretting how little time we have because I could see this could be a 4 hour conversation with no problem whatsoever. I think what the book does really, really well is it gives many, many examples of how to actually apply what you've just said, everything that you've said in real life. There's a lengthy, I was going to start with the early years, but there's a lengthy theoretical example of a boy called Peyton in the book towards the end, which goes into the many different experiences that this boy coming into this imaginary residential program. Good hands, you're in good hands. Good piece of thinking, by the way, on that one.
Right?
Um, and the different ways that the knowledge around the way the nervous system can react and misreact, I guess, can be applied both from the moment he comes in, the preparation he has when he comes into the residential center, the early day, his relationship with the first kid. And this is a lengthy example. I don't think I've come across books which have been so detailed in giving examples of how to apply this. Um, was that deliberate? And maybe we can just pause on that story or that example and you can go into some things which stand out for you.
Yes, because we need to be able to see what this looks like. And you said parents often, when they hear about and learn about polyvagal theory, that our nervous system is detecting safety and danger, that it goes into different states, and that we can co-regulate each other. A lot of times that people have an intuitive recognition of this theory. That's because we all have nervous systems, right? And so, but when I've and it's a simple kind of theory there's a lot of complexity to it, but I can explain it to you in whatever, just a minute or two. But there's a lot of ways that it can be applied. And so that example of Peyton is takes us more into detail about all the different ways that we can understand and think about a nervous system that feels like it's under threat and how we can help it calm down. And then all the ways that that affects a child and all the ways then the adults that are working with them can help out. And so when we first arrive at a place, then our nervous system, when we first see something that is unfamiliar, for the nervous system, the unfamiliar is often feels unsafe. It's the things that we know that we feel the safest with. And so if we are aware of that, then we know then, okay, when a mom and a kid, a dad and a kid, parents and child arrive at our facility, then we want to help them feel welcome and that they belong and that they're seen and heard and understood as quickly as possible. Because welcoming and belonging and feeling seen are all signals to the nervous system that you are in good hands, you're safe here. And so that's the first step. And then how does the person answer the phone? If they're a little bit irritated, I called the doctor's office with my daughter this week, and the person on the phone was a little irritable, and there was an echo on the phone, so that made me and my daughter a little irritable too. And it just didn't go so well. And I was left with a feeling like this might be a very nice person, that I was talking to, but I got left with a feeling like, does she know what she's doing? Is my daughter going to get good care at the doctor? That kind of thing. So we actually, from whatever state we're in, we start telling a story. Deb Dana says, story follows state. So whatever state we're in, we're going to tell a different story if we're in an irritated state than if we're in that calm and welcoming state. And so then what are the connections that this child can make? And how can um, those connections help them to feel welcomed, included, and safe as well? So, yes, it's a very detailed story because it tells like how you can comprehensively start thinking about these things. I think somebody that's listened this far in this podcast will already have some ideas about how to apply this. And so what we wanted to do was to give even more and more ideas about that. How do you repair things when you've made a mistake with a child? Interestingly, if you study attunement, which is like we're talking about, like, can we tell what's happening with our kid and make an appropriate response to it? That if we're attuned about 30% of the time, then that leads to a secure attachment. 30%. I used to think of it as like in school, you'd get a grade and you needed an 80% or a 90% to get a B or an A. And I was thinking that was sort of the standard I was trying to hold myself to with my kids that I was always falling miserably short. And when I read that 30% statistic, I felt so relieved. My nervous system relaxed. So thinking of polyvagal theory, my nervous system was like, oh man, maybe I'm not a terrible father after all. And then I realized, oh, 30%, that is a batting average in baseball of a 300 batting average, which is enough to get you into the Major League Hall of Fame if you've got a 300 batting average. So this made me feel a lot better. We have to get it right 3 out of 10 times and then fix the times that we didn't get it right. And if we fix the times, that also calms the nervous system. And doing that over and over again is what really builds that security within a person's psychology, but also within their nervous system. And they feel secure with us if over time that anytime something's gone wrong, we've come back and fixed it. So then they realize, oh, this relationship, nothing can go so wrong in this relationship that it can't get fixed, that we can't, our relationship is strong here.
Yeah.
It's resilient. So yeah, so that's part of the reason for the lengthy story.
The bond gets stronger as it gets broken, as it were, and that's a tremendously empowering message for embattled parents and caregivers as well of any kind. We're coming to the end of our focus on the book itself. I've got so much I'd like to say, but there is one piece which I think is topical at the moment. You mentioned in the book that polyvagal theory is quite far away from the DCSM and the ICD and the labeling of children. As a child psychiatrist, do you want to maybe go into more detail on that? And do you feel that the labeling and diagnosis, I don't want to say industry, but model has met its match and seen its day? I do feel like there's increasing criticism of the categorization of the human experience, at least.
Well, what I would say is I'm okay with diagnoses and categories, but what I tell the medical students that I work with is that the categories work for us. They're not the boss of us, you know? And so I'm opposed to when the categories take on this authority that we can't dispute, because that then robs people of their humanity, and we don't see the person in front of us. And everybody has a unique nervous system. Everybody's is a little bit different, just like our thumbprints are different, which is one of the things that we talk about in the book. But at the same time, everybody's nervous system works about in the same way. So if we learn about the nervous system, we can both feel a connection with each other, no matter what culture we're from, what our background is, what our religion is, all of those kinds of things, because there's enough commonalities in the things that I've been talking about that you and I can find some common ground. But there's also enough uniqueness that I'm never going to think I'm the same person as Patty, and I'm always going to be interested in, well, how is it for you? And the diagnoses, categories, that kind of thing doesn't give us both that sense of commonality and that sense of uniqueness. And so really understanding a theory like the polyvagal theory adds those two kinds of things, to diagnoses. Like if you have pain in the lower right part of your abdomen, then maybe you have appendicitis. That's probably a good thing to know. But it's also a good thing to know who's the person that has appendicitis. A famous doctor from the 1800s and 1900s, William Osler, said it's more important to know what kind of person has a disease than what kind of disease the person has. And polyvagal theory really lets you know, well, who is this person? It gives you the questions. It gives you and to know, who am I as well.
There's a beautiful quote in the book, which I'll read as we come to the end of this focus on this marvelous book, which is Polyvagal Theory in the Developing Child, Systems of Care for Strengthening Kids, Families, and Communities by Marilyn Sanders and George Thompson, who we're blessed to be with today. The quote goes, "Tell us, please, what treatment in an emergency is administered by ear? I met his gaze and I did not blink. Words of comfort," I said to my father. Um, that quote sat very deeply with me when I read it last year, George. And I must tell you as well that the story of Peyton, which is a theoretical story, left me in tears, actually, which I wasn't expecting. Got some quick fire questions for you, which we'll just deal with right at the start. And hopefully, this will be a window into what an amazing human being you are. And they refer to your childhood. And that's the conversation we're going to talk about today, being a child and being a parent to a child. And the first question is, what's your earliest childhood memory?
So when I was 3, I remember learning that my grandfather had died, my father's father. I still have an image of the hallway in our house. I don't know why we were in the hallway, but I remember hearing about that. And an interesting thing that I processed later on is that I realized later that I was thinking like what it would be like to lose a father, but I was thinking of it from a 3-year-old perspective, which would be catastrophic. And I was thinking that my father had that same experience, but he was, in his later 20s. So his experience was really different than what I was imagining. And I didn't realize that till, frankly, talking with a therapist later on, that I was like, oh, I misconstrued what his response would have been to that situation. And that's not something that's unusual for kids, especially kids that age, that they're thinking about things from their perspective rather than from a broader perspective. Because how could they? They have no idea what it would be like to be a 27-year-old father.
Mm, very powerful. Next question. If you could go back to any day in your childhood, what day would that be and why?
So, my grandparents had a lake house, and I'm not sure of a particular day, but this is a typical day. And the lake house had room for all four of my grandparents' kids, my mother and her three siblings and their families. And I had a group of friends that were there, and this was the, you know, late 60s, early 70s. And so I could go out and play all day long with my friends in the woods and make forts and throw rocks in the water and sometimes throw rocks at each other. And my grandmother had this dinner bell that she would ring and we could hear it through the woods and we would come home. And then coming back home, my family was often sitting around. My uncles may be cleaning fish. My mother and father may be sitting in a chair reading. My grandmother and another aunt may be cooking food. And so I could go out from this adventure to back to the family and be ensconced in this, wealth of family activity all going on. And I would love to do that again.
Oh, I can see myself there as well. So I'd be throwing a rock with you or maybe at you or dodging one from you too. If you could meet your 10-year-old self, what would you say to him?
Hmm. I think first I would say, it's gonna be okay, buddy. And you're gonna be all right. And who you are as a person already is going to be a person that you like and that will actually have benefit to other people. And yeah, I think those kinds of things. And there was a book I read, Patty. I can't remember if we talked about this, called Dibs in Search of Self. It was a book on child therapy that around the age of 10 that I read. And I really liked it. And I think I decided to be a child psychiatrist around that age. I actually asked my best friend when I was applying for my child psychiatry training, there was a question, when did you know you wanted to be a child psychiatrist? And I said, Gray, when did I want to be a child psychiatrist? He said, when you were 8. And so I would say to my 10-year-old self, keep learning about those things. If you like learning about these things, keep reading about them, keep learning about them. It will come in handy.
Isn't that just a beautiful reminder to all mums and dads out there that if your child shows an interest in something, it's probably a good idea to really push them in it because there's some destiny involved there.
Absolutely.
Okay, fourth question. What are you most grateful for from your upbringing?
So well, so the house I grew up in, so my mom and dad, my dad was a Christian counselor. My mother was the principal of a school, and there were tons of books. And so I pulled that book off the shelf and read it. And my family was all about learning and exploring and growing. And it's something that I really still enjoy. And I think that there was so much support for me to learn about what I was curious about um, and that kind of thing. So I would say that the warm relationship that sort of I was ensconced in that promoted learning and exploring and growth and development.
Wonderful. Final quick fire question. What was your favorite hobby or activity as a child?
So when I was in high school, um, I had a friend that had birds, and I got interested in birds. He had an aviary, and I talked to my mother. It was sort of like this desk that I'm sitting at now, sort of built-in desk in my house. And I said, Mom, could I turn that desk into an aviary? She said, yes. Because I had birds in a cage in my room, in my bedroom. And so I put a screen in front of the desk, and that became this aviary. And then I realized that my closet would make it even better aviary. And I said, could I make my closet, these two doors that open and closed, into an aviary? And so I put a huge screen in front of that, and I had like 15 or 20 birds, cockatiels and budgies and parakeets and finches. And and so I lived with these 20 birds in my room for a couple of years in high school, and then when it became time to go to college, I gave them away. But throughout my life, I've had birds at various times, and as a kid, it actually gave me a chance to do something kind of crazy. I was like, I wish my mother was still alive so I could ask her, "What were you thinking?" I'm not sure I would have said yes to that as a parent. But I'm so glad that she did because I love those birds and I love that experience.
So if you're joining us right now, we're talking and listening to a very beautiful human being, Dr. George Thompson. And George and I met at a Polyvagal Theory conference in Berlin, where he did a presentation on a case study about a boy, which left me breathless and very emotional. And George, I wonder if we can briefly cover for those of us listening now what polyvagal theory is, and maybe if you wanted to, you could even go back to that story of that beautiful boy who you helped working as a child psychiatrist.
Sure. So polyvagal theory, the vagal part has to do with the vagus nerve, which is part of the autonomic nervous system. Well, that sounds very scientific, but here's three things about the polyvagal theory that anybody can understand. One of them is that our nervous system is constantly monitoring to see if we're in danger or we're safe. Have you ever had that feeling like you walk into some place and you get a little bit of a creepy vibe or a little bit of a hair on the back of your neck, standing up on the back of your neck kind of vibe? That's our nervous system detecting things around us to see if we're safe or we're not safe. Or the other side would be you walk into some place and you suddenly relax. Our nervous system has said we're safe. And so one part of the polyvagal theory is that monitoring, which we call neuroception. Another part is that there are three different states that we can go into. And I've talked about two of them. One is that state of fear, which is a state of mobilization. Our adrenaline gets going. The extreme end of it is fight or flight, and a state of where we let down our guard and we feel safe with each other. That's a state of relaxation and engagement, connection. And then we can also go into a playing dead, playing possum kind of a state when things are really, really upsetting or danger is inescapable. And that can happen all through the day, actually to small extents, not just that when something really big happens. So we've got this monitoring of safety and danger that then puts us into one or more of these three states. And then the third part is just how connected our nervous systems are. And our nervous systems, yours and mine right now, are connected. And your nervous system is reading signals from me, and my nervous system is reading signals from you. And so if I'm in a safe state, I will do what's called co-regulate your nervous system, meaning that the safety from my state will get conveyed to yours. And if I stay in my safe state long enough, it will bring your state into a state of safety and regulation as well. So the polyvagal theory is really about how this is happening all the time. And it affects whatever state we're in, affects how we're thinking about things, how we see things, how we interpret things that we don't actually know what it is yet, the stories that we tell about what's going on, and even how we feel in terms of whether how capable we feel. So in a shutdown state, we're going to feel like we can't do things. But in that safe and relaxed state, we're going to feel capable and strong and more able to do things.
So let's say that I'm a parent of a 6 or 7 year old kid, and they haven't had any profound trauma, but on the adverse childhood experience level of trauma. But nonetheless, we're really worried about our kids' constant meltdowns. They're 6 or 7. When they were 2 or 3, it felt like it was no big deal because every kid has a daily meltdown at that age. But our 6 or 7 year old seems to be, compared to our other child, quite aggressive, quite difficult to deal with, rude, flies off the handle, as we say in English at least all the time. And the duration of those meltdowns or acting out can go on for a while, and they're quite scary to deal with. based on what you've said, could we be talking about our child having one of these fight or flight reactions? Would that be applicable to me as a parent?
Absolutely. So, fight, if we think about what fight is actually a state of anger. And when we feel angry, we feel like fighting. When we feel like fighting, we feel angry. And the flight response is more of a fear, anxiety response. Um, and a kid can go from a flight response to a fight response. So if you have a child that some kids like running when they feel really threatened or stirred up. And if they run, but you block them, which is not a bad idea if they're going to go in the street or something. But when you block somebody that's in flight, then they often and most of the time go into fight response. And so um, you said that parent has two different kids, and the other kid didn't have these same kind of reactions. And our nervous systems are all different from each other, even though there's these commonalities as well. So we have all have unique nervous systems, the way that they work, what they get stirred up by, what calms them down, things like that. And so for this child, they may have a strong fight or flight response, whereas the other child may have a stronger shutdown response. They're more likely to get quiet and go to their room and maybe sulk or pout or, for a while, want to hide under the covers for a while. Um, and so one of the things that I do in that situation is I want to talk with my child after it's all over with about what was going on for them. Because when something happens in our nervous system, it usually happens outside of our awareness. But if we take some quiet moments a little later on and think back about it, then we can oftentimes have an idea about what was happening. And if I'm going to talk with my child that's had a meltdown, I'm going to say, "Hey, buddy, I'd like to talk with you about what went on back there." And first of all, let me say, you're not in trouble. Because if they think they're in trouble, that will be another signal of danger that's more likely to stir up the fight or flight again. You're not in trouble. I'm just really curious about it. And I'm also wondering what that was like for you because it didn't look like very much fun. It looked like you were suffering. And I feel for you in my heart for that going on. Um, so, is it okay if we put our heads together and think about this for a minute of what was happening or what that was like for you or what was helpful? Can we do that for a minute? And they're 6 or 7, so it may be a child that's not too good at putting feelings into words. Um, and so I may say, let's draw a picture of it, if that's the case. If they're better at talking, I might say, do you know what got you stirred up in the first place? You know, they may have been working on something and they got frustrated because they couldn't do it. Somebody may have taken their toy or that wasn't their toy wasn't in the place that they thought it should be. It may have been that they had to stop doing something and they have a hard time shifting gears from doing one thing to another thing. But I'm looking for all of those kinds of things. And then I just want to know what it was like for them. Because if I'm asking about their thoughts and their feelings and their experience, that's actually one of the ways of conveying safety to another person. I see you, I know you, I hear you. I want what you're going through is important to me. And if your experience is important to me, that means you're important to me, and that means you're safe with me. And then also part of me is looking at, are there things that we could do differently? You know, if it's they're playing a video game and that's always hard to stop playing a video game, I'm gonna read something about, is there a better way to stop playing a video game than you can ask ChatGPT that question these days, right? I haven't asked him that question. What I learned myself is if I say to a kid, let's push pause rather than turn that off, it seems to have a better impact because it conveys in the statement pushing pause that we can push pause again and then it'll keep going again.
we're definitely going to come back to this idea of what we can do in that situation. But I'm wondering for a parent who's had this lingering thought, oh my God, there's something wrong with my kids, even though I don't think there should be, because we're having so many meltdowns, so many difficult moments, so much resentment. Again, we'll stick in the kind of, let's say, 6 to 10 range, in a typically developing family, typically existing family. Um, what would you say to that parent if they have come to you with this hypothetical case of this child in that situation? Is there something wrong with the kid, quote unquote?
Um, well, if they've come to me in my office as a child psychiatrist, then in that situation, I'm gonna do an evaluation. And what that involves is asking questions that might tell me if a child has a particular way of doing things or that might, indicate one thing or another. Um, there are some kids that have bigger feelings than other kids. So that will be one of the things that I would be looking for. Of course, very popular to ask a child psychiatrist, does my child have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder? Which
Yes.
is something that's associated with having big meltdowns. So I have questionnaires that a parent can fill out that will give some answers, that people that answer the questions in these ways. Um, but what I would say is that meltdowns are on a continuum, and that most all of us, I have meltdowns, and most all of us have meltdowns yeah, exactly, at one time or another. And there are things that go into having a meltdown. It's usually something that is dangerous, but dangerous is interesting. It doesn't just mean physically dangerous. It could also mean emotionally dangerous, dangerous in a relationship, or dangerous in what's important to me. Sometimes I call that existential danger. And so if a child really wants to get good grades and they've made a grade that they don't consider good enough, that could put them into a meltdown because getting good grades is so important to them. And so I'm going to both look at, are there conditions that this could fit into, but then what's it like for that child to have that meltdown? What are the things that seem to trigger it? What are the things that seem like could help it? How oftentimes a kid afterwards feels really terrible about themselves, and parents don't have much training in how to talk about that. And so being able to say, to a parent, and I do this in my office frequently, I'll say, you know, why don't you ask your kid what it's like afterwards? How do they feel about having the meltdown? Because that's not a question that just it doesn't seem to pop into people's minds naturally. It didn't pop into mine naturally when I was a parent, when I'm still a parent, but as a parent, until I learned about this. And a lot of times they'll say, I feel really bad. If you ask them right in the middle of the meltdown, they'll say, I don't care, whatever, or shortly after. But if it's been a few hours or the next day or something like that, how do you feel about yourself, when you have a meltdown? Usually they'll say, I don't feel like I feel like I'll ask them, do you feel like you're a bad kid sometimes? Or you feel like you're not very lovable in that moment? Or do you feel like there's something wrong with you? And a lot of times they'll say yes. And I'll empathize with, that's a really awful feeling, you know? And um, what I'll sometimes do to tease them is say, when you wake up in the morning, do you decide you're going to try and be as angry as possible today? And I've asked hundreds of kids this now, and none of them have ever said yes, right? They go like no, and they look at me like I'm crazy, which I like when they look at me like I'm crazy. No, that'd be crazy. Okay, well then where does this anger come from? If it's not you waking up and deciding you want to be angry, where is it coming from? I don't know. And I'll say, I don't know either. And well, if you don't put it there deliberately and you don't know where it comes from, then I don't think you can be a bad kid because it's there. Because how would you be a bad kid? You don't know where it comes from and you didn't put it there. But if there was a way to work on it so that you had more control over it, would you like to do that? And they always say yes to that. I'd like to be in control of it. Okay, that's what we're going to work on. I'm not going to make you feel like you're a bad kid for having this or for not knowing what it is, but I will see what are the things that we can come up with together that might be able to be helpful for you.
There's a line in your book, Polyvagal Theory in the Developing Child, which we've been discussing, which you co-authored with Marilyn Sanders, which is state begets state. And what you've just, I guess, described is an excellent example of state begetting state, where one person's attuned, regulated system can lend itself to another person's, and that's exactly the parent-child relationship and the beauty of the parent-child relationship as well. Um, I'm reminded, by the way, as you spoke, of how often as a child I can remember feeling uniquely lonely, uniquely useless, uniquely swamped by emotions, which I didn't realize other people had as well. And that's something I think of quite often, actually, working with parents myself and talking with them about this issue. So never underestimate that experience for your child either. I love that, George.
Uh,
And I would like to come back to this idea of, okay, we've got this kid and we've got a great technique for talking with our child. Is there anything we can do in terms of long-term strategies which might pay off to kind of support our child to have that better response to the external stimuli, to the negative thing, whatever it is, whether it's your brother or sister, sibling taking your toy or the bad grades? Can we work? Is there anything we can do as parents, or is it kind of fixed and you just kind of have to learn how to manage it and be regulated yourself?
yeah. Do you have a different relationship with your emotions than you did when you were a kid?
Just a bit.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So the answer is yes. That it's not yes that it's fixed, but yes that there are things that we can do. And my relationship with my emotions are different than they were 10 years ago. So it's not just at kids. So if you're a parent or a grandparent, we can have different relationships with what's going on inside of us across the lifespan. Um, and so with the kids that we're talking about here, if we work upstream and find out what's going on, one of my favorite phrases too, which is also in the book, what's happening that's happening. And so if we think what's happening that the kid is getting angry, we're looking now at the context of what's going on. And what is it about that situation that is triggering for my child? Then there may be things that we can do to be helpful to them or that they come up with themselves. It turns out, like when we get pretty specific about this and when we're tuning into what the kid is feeling, in my experience, at least half the time, they have ideas themselves spontaneously. I know what I could do. I saw this kid the other day. He was 4, he was almost 5, and he was having meltdowns. That's why he came into the office. And we had this kind of conversation with him. And at a certain point, he says, I know what I can do. And I'm like, what? He goes, well, I could tell my teacher that I'm upset and I could crawl and I need to crawl under the chair, which is what he had done in the office, and that I'll come back out when I know what's going on. I'm like, great, that's awesome. I said, Mom, can you help him have that conversation with the teacher about that? And she said, Oh, I'll be glad to. And the teacher was a very receptive person. So they had that conversation. How amazing is it to be 4 years old and to come up with your own solutions for your emotional issues that are going on? So this was a mom that was, so attuned to her kid that um, I'm sure that they had had lots of conversations like this, and then he could come up with that. So we want to find out, like, what is it about this situation that's most triggering? And is there something we can do about that? A different way of thinking, a way of calming down, a different way of looking at it, some other resources. Can I go talk to mom at that point? What is it that can be helpful? So that'll be one of the kind of things. And then there may be things that we do that help a child to feel grounded, centered in themselves just on a regular basis, not related to meltdowns themselves, but just how do I feel more emotionally stable, um, going through my life?
You can't avoid the bad ones. mums and dads, and I'm saying that to myself as well. The other day, I was thinking about pain and thinking, yeah, I get that pain helps you, but God, it hurts, you know. But it's a mechanism that we need, and it's a primal moving energy of life, and we would be much worse off without the bad emotions. George, I'm wondering whether, as mums and dads and as caregivers, our child's meltdowns and our reaction to it says as much about us as it does about them. Would that be fair to say?
Can you tell me what you're thinking and a little bit about that? And then I
I
have some
apologize
ideas,
for
but
asking an
yeah.
ill-worded question. Um, our strong, let's say, reaction to our kids' meltdowns with those negative thoughts of, oh my gosh, maybe there's something wrong with my kid. Maybe my kid's got one of those labels like ADHD, maybe, and that's not a bad idea to sometimes go and ask. Um, is there something wrong with me? Have I raised my kid wrong? That kind of negative loop that we can get
Ah,
into.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
our reaction to, again, this external situation does say an awful lot about our own ability to be tuned and regulated, and our own ongoing life's relationship with our own emotions. Um, it strikes me that often for parents, at least of my generation, it feels like the first time we really, for most of us, start thinking about what is it to go through a meltdown of our own is when we're parents and we start to see it in our children. And I've always had a private theory, which is for the average parent, it was often because they weren't allowed to have those experiences as kids because they were put into positions of pain or fear, and they
Mm.
learned to mask and shadow those emotions, and now they're seeing them in their child, so it's particularly threatening to the parent.
Yeah. So one of the ways I think about this is that, we were talking about how being attuned to the child is helpful. But if there's a thing called, which I know you know about, the window of tolerance. What is this range of experiences that I have that I can tolerate, that I can be with, and I can still think flexibly, and I can reflect on, and I can um, control my impulses and that kind of thing. So one of the things that can happen is our child can have an experience that we need to attune to in order to help them have that experience within their window of tolerance, make it a tolerable experience for them. But it may be an experience that's outside of our window of tolerance. And so then what do we do? Um, I think is one of the ways of saying your question. If something happens that's outside my window of tolerance, and so that's going to happen. That doesn't mean a person is a bad parent. It's actually, you know, um, being a parent is a huge opportunity for personal growth. I don't know if you've noticed, but for me as a parent, I became a child psychiatrist before I became a parent. And that was very humbling. Then when I had a child, I'm like, oh, wait a second. This isn't as easy as I'm thinking it looks, you know? And I really need to grow and learn here. And um, so there's all these opportunities for growth. And one of them is when what my child is going through is outside of my window of tolerance. And then we may make a mistake. That happened to me a few weeks ago with my daughter. She was sick uh, and she hadn't gone to school. And on one of the days, I said, she said, I'm feeling better. I'm going to do my homework. I'm going to go to school the next day. And she didn't do her homework and she didn't go to school the next day. And here's the terrible thing I said to her. I said, if you don't get your homework done, you're going to get so far behind. She's getting ready to graduate from high school in May. You're going to get so far behind that you're not going to be able to finish high school on time and you can't start college on time and it's going to be terrible. That was an awful thing for me to say. And she said, Dad, oh, like, okay. So I took myself off for a while and I came back and I said, oh, you know what was going on with me? Your brother had a big set of difficulties right at the time he was getting ready to graduate. And I was thinking in my mind, I wasn't thinking it, but was in the back of my mind that this could happen to you. And when I think about it, actually consciously, I don't think that's going to happen to you. I have a lot of faith in your ability to get things done, and I'm really sorry, that but it was outside of my window of tolerance until I took myself away and could think about it for a little bit. And I talked to a friend and said, "You wouldn't believe the terrible thing I said to my daughter." And then I got back on solid footing again. And she was grateful that I did that. So, yes, I think I'm a bad parent sometimes. Yes. Do I say dumb things? Obviously. Can I make up for it? Yes. And that's much more important than getting it right the first time.
I'll never forget when I saw Dan Siegel speak, famous author, parenting author, and brilliant neuroscientist. And he started talking about how he got upset at his kids. And I remember this absolute weight coming off my shoulders, going, "Oh, so even he gets upset at it. Okay, so now we're talking because we often get wrapped up in a lot of guilt, thinking there's a family out there where none of this happens or this doesn't happen. And scrolling on social media, it does feel like everyone's having a really happy life and great grades and no problems and smiley faces. And the reality in our house can feel unique, rather like I did as a child. I guess it's a similar experience we go through as adults. That's an incredibly empowering message, Dr. George. And I'm mindful of time, even though my heart kind of breaks. So I feel like we might have to do an episode two, George. I'm not. You're nodding, so I'll take your word for it that we can do that because I know there's going to be lots of parents with questions. You talk about a model which you mentioned when I saw you in Berlin at the Polyvagal Theory conference, and you mentioned the book as well, PACE, PACE. And I'd really love for you just to go into a little bit of detail about what that means, because I think it's also a really practical approach that parents can also learn from.
Yeah, so Dan Hughes is a psychologist, a child psychologist who in the 80s started working with traumatized kids. And he's the person that I learned that kids that have been traumatized often push adults away. And so he was looking for a way, because relationships have been dangerous, adults had been dangerous to them, so it made sense that they'd push adults away so that they could stay safe. And he was looking for a way to help those kids learn to trust again now that they're living in a different situation. Maybe they're living with their grandparents or a foster home or adoptive family, something like that. But the safe connection itself was sometimes overwhelming for the kid. And so um, he was looking for a way to for adults to convey safety to the child's nervous system. And this acronym PACE stands for being playful, accepting, curious, and empathic. And each of those elements can be signals of safety at a particular moment in time. And so if the accepting part, and as a child psychiatrist, I work with kids that sometimes tell me that they feel suicidal. So I use that as an example, but it could be a kid saying they feel upset. But a kid that would tell me that they had felt suicidal, I would say, well, you have so much to live for. I would give them a lot of reasons why they shouldn't feel suicidal. But then when I learned about PACE, I realized, oh, I'm not accepting their experience. I'm wanting to change their experience. And wanting to change somebody's experience, like if I just say to you, I'd like to change your experience, you're going to go, well, wait a second. How do you know I want to change my experience? You're going to push back against it. And that's what kids do too. On the other hand, if I'm accepting of their experience, that feels safe. So instead of saying, you have so much to live for, I'll say, that sounds like a terrible feeling. If you feel like it would be better to be dead than to be alive, to be dead and not feel this, you must be feeling something really awful. And so I'm accepting that they're having that feeling. I can be curious about it and say, can you tell me some about it? I'd like to know what that's like for you. I can be empathic, wow, that sounds really so painful. And the pain feels like it's never going to go away. And that's why, sometimes you feel like this may be the only way to escape the pain. Now I'm accepting the child's experience. I'm empathizing with it. I'm being curious about it. Playfulness often comes later there's two meanings from Dan Hughes of playfulness. One of them is kind of the joking around playfulness that we would normally understand. Another is that whatever the child is talking about doesn't bring us down, so that we maintain our ability to think this isn't going to be disastrous, you know, so that I can talk about things really terrible like abuse or suicidal thoughts and not feel like I have to go into the depths of despair myself, because that's not going to be helpful to the child. So if I can be playful or not despairing, accepting, curious, and empathic, then that can convey that I'm interested in the child. I want to know what they're thinking and feeling. That means that they're worth listening to and that I'm a safe person to be with. And this is a safe way for a kid to start to learn how to trust somebody. And it's interesting because no matter what the kid says, I can be accepting of that. They might say, "This is stupid. I don't want to talk about this." I can be accepting. Okay, can you tell me what the worst part about this is? Or have you had a psychiatrist as stupid as me before? You know, how did you get so unlucky to have a psychiatrist like me? So I can be playful or accepting of them telling me that I'm a dumb person. I work with people from different backgrounds and different races and different ethnicities. And so I can say, you know, what's it like to work with an old white guy to a young black kid? You know, that must be kind of weird. Are you worried about that? You know, what comes to mind looking at me? I probably don't look like the people that you look like. So I can be accepting of that child's experience as well.
It's a great framework and it's applicable to any parent in any situation. And Dr. George, as you've already said, if it didn't go right for you today, tomorrow's another opportunity to do a bit of pace. And the bond gets strengthened with continual wear and tear. Dr. George, if I wanted to follow you, keep in touch with you, buy one of your amazing books, or just hear more from you, where should I go?
So you could go to my website is drgeorge.club, drgeorge.club, and you can find out information there. I have a community called the Listening Parent Community where I teach about these things with a newsletter and master classes and things like that. So drgeorge.club is a good place to start.
Final question. If there's one thing that a parent could and should do for their child, summarized in kind of one sentence, what should that be?
Take care of themselves. Because if we all have a caregiving part of our brain, but if we're too stressed out, it's hard to get that part of the brain to come online. But if we have de-stressed a bit, if we've done something to take care of ourselves, and that can be a conversation with a friend, it could be writing in a journal, it could be taking a walk in nature, praying, all kinds of different things. Everybody knows for themselves what that is. And even if they do it a little bit, um, then that would be helpful in having the caregiving part of their brain more accessible to them. So it's all about the parents and the parents' well-being. You know, they've already done the hard part. They've had the child. They they're listening to you, and now giving themselves a little bit of a break. I find that that is the best thing for most parents. And then the natural kind of caregiving that we're programmed to do can come into being.
Yeah, it's simple, really. It's just the first 18 years that hurts the most. Dr. George S. Thompson, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. And I guess I can try and get you to agree live on air if you'd come back and maybe speak in the future. Would that be okay?
Absolutely. I'll be glad to. I love talking with you, Patty, and I love talking with your audience.
Yeah, thank you very much. If you've loved this interview with Dr. George Thompson, if you're raring at the bit to have round two or even round three, then let us know in the comments where you find this episode. Dr. George, thank you.
All right.